Good evening. Some of y'all are awake. Good evening.
Good evening.
Oh, that sounds so much better. I am super excited to be here. I know a couple of y'all follow me on Facebook, and you know I've been on the road for the past 2 weeks from Gettysburg all the way to Columbia, Tennessee on Tuesday night, and here tonight, and I'm going home tomorrow because I need to do laundry. So excited to be here. I'm excited. I wanted to come speak to y'all for a long time. Partially, I love getting out and sharing history, but partially because I have more Confederate ancestors buried in this county than any other place. Any other place in the United States. Parts of my family settled here. They're on the 1840 census, so sometime prior to that date. And I wanted to, just briefly, before I dive into what we're going to talk about tonight, my ancestors, the one that I joined the SCV under is George W. Hardy, 9th Alabama Cavalry, that's buried at the Hardy Cemetery out in the western part of the county. Coleman H. Coffin of the 50th Alabama, buried at the Lake Cemetery. William H. Glanton of the 37th Alabama, buried in the Sandlin Cemetery. And Benjamin Franklin Gray of the 50th Alabama, buried in the Salem Cemetery. And I want to say thank you for keeping those graves marked, for putting those markers designating their service in the Confederate States. That means so much to me. And if you want to talk more about that later, we can. But let's talk a little Confederate history, because that's like my favorite thing in the world. 3 decades ago, I was working on a book, which is what I do. And this particular Confederate soldier had wrote home to his wife back in Gaston County, North Carolina. And he said, "Thank you for the eggs. Only one of them was broken." And I'm like, good Lord, I wouldn't ship eggs today. UPS, FedEx, anything like that. But his wife had made him a box from home, had put it on a train, and that package had found him in Northern Virginia, and only one of the eggs she shipped had broke during that journey. And a question was planted in my mind right then. How do you ship eggs? 3 decades later, I'm working on this project. Lo and behold, I find another soldier who was writing to his wife, "Please send me some eggs. And when you send them, pack them in sawdust so they don't break." So it took me 3 decades to get to that answer. When I finished writing my history of the Branch Lane Brigade, I had 5 pages that dealt with food. And I thought, gosh, there's a lot of material to cover, to look at, to write a book about food and a common Confederate soldier in the Army of Northern Virginia. So I did. I sat down and I went through 300 sets of just over 300 sets of letters and diaries, and created an almost day-by-day account of what the common Confederate soldier was eating, what he hated eating or was tired of eating, what he wanted from home, which is something we'll talk about here in a couple of minutes. Rural people, whether you're in the South or in the North, prior to the war, ate pork all the time. You would slaughter your hogs in the fall or the early winter months. You would salt them down. You would hang them in the smokehouse, so you would have meat for the rest of the year. They grew wheat for flour or corn for cornmeal. They would have vegetables, potatoes, beans. They would source things out of the woods. They would go hunt blackberries, blueberries, whatever. It was a pretty common diet. And the men were largely responsible for that part of it. They plowed, they sowed the seeds, they did the harvest, they scalded the hogs, or they killed the hogs, they scalded them, they butchered the hogs, they hung the meat up. That was their responsibility. When the foodstuffs came through the door to the cabin or the house, their responsibility ended there. And it was the women who would take those foodstuffs, those raw materials, and would make dinner. The war comes, and you take thousands, tens of thousands of young men and throw them in together in camp, and you give them salt pork and flour or cornmeal, and they had not a clue what to do with it. It was a disaster. A member of the 31st Virginia, this is all 1861, writes home, quote, "Then commenced a series of hardships pertaining to camp life. The cooking department was the greatest obstacle. Our mess, none knew the first principles of cooking. We learned, however, very rapidly." Another soldier, same time period, 1st Georgia Infantry, quote, "Our eating here is the worst feature. We have plenty, and that would be good if prepared right. Our biscuits are very different from those we were raised on. I do not know what I would give for a dinner at home. It makes me hungry to think of clean milk and butter and well-baked bread, even if there was no salt in it. Do not believe that I am suffering for quantity, but for quality of cooking." Almost every single letter in that time period says the same thing. At this point, in 1861, they're getting plenty of rations. Nobody knows how to cook. So the way it worked was kind of like this. Your company officers or your NCO would divide the company up into messes. So y'all are a mess, and y'all are a mess. Some of my cousins are sitting over here, so they're definitely a mess. Y'all are a mess. And you are responsible as a group of people for cooking these rations that are given to you. Each mess is typically issued. I know we have this idea that a Confederate soldier went into war carrying his own skillet and his own tin pot and all this other stuff. By and large, it didn't work that way. Each mess is issued a frying pan called a spider, had a long handle and had legs on it, and they are issued a pot, soup pot, stock pot, whatever you want to call it. And this group of people would get together around a fire and cook their food, and this group would get together around the fire and cook their food. That's important to lay that groundwork. It'll be really important as we move on here to talk about the Confederate soldier in different parts of the war. Rations themselves did not improve as time went on. They only got worse and worse. Now I know, let me ask this question. How do y'all feel about Braxton Bragg? Anybody like Braxton Bragg?
Best general the Union had.
So that's what we say here in the 21st century, that Braxton Bragg was the best general the Union had. We say that he was the most hated general. In that time period, the most hated general was Lucius Northrop. He was commissary general of the Confederate armies. This man is so incompetent. First of all, he's a friend of Jefferson Davis. Do I need to say anything else? He's that buddy system with Jefferson Davis. He was the third man that Jefferson Davis picked. The first two declined to be commissary general. How inept is Lucius Northrop? I'll give you an example. In 1861, Lucius Northrop wants the commissary officers to go into northern Virginia, buy foodstuffs from farmers, put it on a train, and send it to the warehouses in Virginia, or in Richmond, Virginia, so that the officers in the various regiments and brigades can requisition food from Richmond, and it goes back on the exact same train that it came down on to feed the army in the exact same place it came from. That is Lucius Northrop. He does not improve as time goes on. Robert E. Lee feuded with Lucius Northrop throughout the entire war. We don't think of Lee as feuding with anybody except maybe Grant or Hooker or the other federal generals. They had a verbal feud throughout the entire war. Lee wants more food for his men. Lucius Northrop wants all the food in the warehouses in Richmond. The rations do not get any better as time goes on. North Carolina soldier writes in January of 1863 from a camp near Fredericksburg, quote, "I want you to see as little uneasiness about us as you possibly can, as it will be of no advantage to us. You need not think the government will allow us to starve or go naked, although we get scarce at times." Are they scarce of food or scarce of clothing? Probably both. He didn't specify in his letters. Probably people will sometimes ask in like a question and answer time, what's the most surprising thing you found in the book? This quote right here. It's from one of James Longstreet's staff officers. It's June of 1864. And this man writes, quote, "We are eating new beautiful onions from Nassau. Whether raised in Connecticut or not, I cannot say. They are imported at Wilmington. With our onions, we have bacon cured in Ohio and shipped to Nassau to be sent to us by blockade runners." By mid-1864, the vast majority of the foodstuffs feeding the Army of Northern Virginia was coming from up north. A merchant or a broker will go to a farmer and say, "I see you have a lot of fine hogs here. Would you like to sell them?" And the farmer will go, "Sure, we'll sell it." And the broker will take those hogs, he will salt them, kill them, salt them down, put them on a train. That train will take them to a port city like Philadelphia or Boston or Baltimore. The broker will pay off the port official. Things in government have not changed. The port official will sign off, "Oh, none of this stuff is going where it shouldn't be," because he's got money now in his pocket. And they'll take those hogs or onions or vegetables or whatever, they will put them on a ship. That ship will do one of three things. It will either go to Nova Scotia and go to the Bahamas. It'll go to London and go to the Bahamas, or it will go straight to the Bahamas. And when that shipment of hogs, salt pork, gets to the Bahamas, the ship captain will then either sell or trade it for cotton that has been run through the blockade. Those foodstuffs will go on a shallow draft blockade runner and will be run into the port of Wilmington up the Cape Fear River. It will be then unloaded, put on a train, and taken to Lee's army outside of Petersburg, below Petersburg. And everybody knew about it. Grant will complain, "How am I supposed to beat these people when we are feeding them?" Finally, in March of 1865, when does Lee surrender? April of 65. In March of 1865, Lincoln will tell Grant, "You can shut down this trade." It's not just this, though. If you live near a federally controlled area, Norfolk, Virginia, New Bern, North Carolina, Memphis, Tennessee, New Orleans, if you live close to any of those, you can grow cotton. You can take it through the lines. You can sell it. Now, you don't make a lot of money for it, but you can sell it. Because there are a lot of federal officers in these places that want that cotton because they can make a lot of money off of that cotton. You can then turn around and buy seeds or whatever to take back to your farm to grow foodstuffs to sell to the Confederate Army. And everybody knows all of this. A huge chunk of the foodstuffs that fed not just the Army of Northern Virginia, but the Army of Tennessee as well, comes from up north during the war in some form or fashion. What I need and want to explore more, and I'm not quite sure how yet, is how far up that money went that paid off the brokers, or that paid off the port officials, that the brokers are paying to the port officials. I've got rumors that it went all the way up to the Secretary of War's son, and maybe the Secretary of War himself, federal U.S. Secretary of War. That's probably the most surprising thing I found in my research. And we're not talking about a little food stuff. We're talking about millions of pounds just in 1864-65 that went from up north to Nassau and the Bahamas. There's even one account where a group of entrepreneurs, we'll call them that, entrepreneurs, decide that they're going to bypass Nassau and from, I think it was from Boston, sail straight to Wilmington, North Carolina. And the commander in Wilmington, Major General William Henry Chase Whiting, actually arrest them. And there's a paper trail about trying to figure out what to do with these northern sailors that have just boldly sailed into the port of Wilmington with a load of foodstuffs. They do confiscate all the foodstuffs, and Whiting feeds his men from there. Anybody ever heard that story? Amazing what we can learn, at least for me. Soldiers would beg for food from home the entire time. As soon as they get into camp, they are writing letters home, because they're only getting salt pork, they are getting flour, they're getting cornmeal, they're sometimes getting hardtack, hard crackers, ship's biscuits, and some vegetables. So they are writing home all the time, going, will you send me something to eat? One particular soldier writes, Father, I received a letter from Aunt Ann today stating that she had sent us a box of provisions. This evening the box came, and with it a profusion of every good thing: hams, egg, butter, preserves, biscuit, light bread, and 2 bottles of good whiskey. We will not live elegantly for a while, and ask the Confederacy for nothing but to allow us to remain where we are until we get through with this box. That's actually an Alabama soldier writing in 1861. A month later, a Virginia soldier near Manassas thanked his family for the box containing tomatoes, biscuits, cake, tongue, onions, etc. I was curious. I'm a curious sort. And I actually made a list of all of the things that they asked for in these letters from home. And it's not just privates in the ranks, it's generals as well. William Dorsey Pender writes his wife for things from home. I never found where General Lee wrote his wife asking for things, but he wrote letters thanking Mary, his wife, for things that she had sent to him. So on this list, the things they asked for from home include coffee, tea, mustard, butter, eggs, apples, sweet potatoes, pickled okra, sausages, red pepper, sugar, whiskey, hams, cakes, lard, onions, peaches, honey, brandy, chestnuts, ginger cakes, turkey, apple butter, souse cheese. How many of y'all know what souse is? You know, I was giving the same talk to the camp in Charleston, South Carolina, and none of those fine folks knew what souse was, or hog head cheese. I have an uncle in Georgia who still makes that stuff. My aunt makes him cook it outside. I have eaten it. You put it on crackers and things. I understand why you drink a profusion of beer while you're eating this stuff, because some people like souse. That's okay. I have not acquired that taste. So just as long as y'all know what souse is, everything but the squeal of a pig, and you make this cheese stuff out of it. Do anybody like souse? You need to bring it for the camp sometime. They need that southern experience.
Is it cheese, or is it something?
It's boiled down the head,
Yeah.
ears and feet, and then
But
all
you
the
don't
meat.
add that.
What
to
does it-
milk
what
and
does it
make-
taste like?
You don't
Or does it
add
have
the
to
cheese,
taste?
or is it
You,
gross?
no, it's good.
Good way to summarize it.
Kelly's is the best.
Okay, souse cheese, dried cherries, ketchup, rolls, cider, peas, beans, cabbage, vinegar, beets, squash, cucumbers, sage, possums, tongues, peanuts, krauts, watermelon, grits are the things that I found that they ask for from home. The latest I found someone thanking a family member for a box from home is March 5th, 1865. So they shipped those boxes the entire time of the war. My favorite story, actually there's 3 favorite stories in this chapter. One of them is a soldier deals with a soldier in the 5th Alabama Infantry. Twice his aunt back here in Alabama tried to send him live chickens. The first time nothing arrived. The second time the coop arrived with no chickens in it. Now, I don't mean to speak bad of any of y'all's Confederate ancestors, but somebody saw them live chickens as it went by in that coop and said, they're not going to miss one. They would reach in and pull one out and pluck that thing and cook it and eat it. That second time, if I remember right, I'm not talking about a few chickens. That was a coop of 50 chickens. She tried to send via the railroad to her nephews up near Manassas Junction. These boxes from home were both a very welcomed item and an extreme hardship on these people's families. When the men marched away to go fight in the war, a lot of the women had to take on their responsibilities of plowing and sowing seed and harvesting and slaughtering the livestock, etc., etc. It was a real hardship. Plus, in a lot of areas across the South, like here in North Alabama and where I live in Western North Carolina, we've got raiders that come through on a regular basis. And they will take everything you have. So women and the people back at home got really adept at hiding foodstuffs. They would pry the walls off the cabins and they would stick foodstuffs in there and put the boards back up. They would bury stuff under rocks or in caves. They would, one of my favorite stories, county from where I live, the woman had a potato hole, and she put her good potatoes in the bottom of the hole, put a layer of straw on top, and the rotten potatoes on top of that. When the federal soldiers came by, they rooted around, only found the rotten potatoes, and she saved her seed potatoes for the next year. There was no store to go to get seeds for next year. There was no money. If there was a store, you probably didn't have any money, or your money was worthless. So saving those seeds, the seed potatoes, the beans or whatever, to grow stuff for the next year was extremely important. A thing that we never talk about is starvation. How many people starved? How many civilians starved to death in that time period? That's not a number that's ever recorded.
50,000?
That's not a normal that's ever actually recorded. We can throw numbers out there, but we really don't know. We really don't. So, how did the box system work? A soldier would sometimes announce, hey, I'm at home on leave. If you want me to try and get a box or a package to your soldier through the lines, drop them off at the newspaper office on such and such a date. That's when I'm heading back. The soldier would attempt to ferry those boxes along the rail lines. Railroads are a nightmare in the 1860s. One thing the Federals did that we should have done early in the war is take control of the railroads. And we didn't. The Confederate government did not. In the South, the vast majority of the railroads, that's somebody's little empire. The directors, that's their little empire. So to control their little empire, when they order their locomotives and their rolling stock, it's to their own gauge, the width in between the rails. So the line coming out of South Carolina and going into Charlotte, North Carolina, is a different size than the line coming out of Charlotte and going north toward Virginia. Every single box of foodstuffs has got to be unloaded and put on a different train. And it's a logistical nightmare. And it's not only the food boxes from home, it's regular government rations that are trying to get to other places. It's soldiers trying to get to other places. Everything has to be unloaded. And it's not just in Charlotte, it's all over the South. It's a logistical nightmare. So a lot of times they would try and shepherd these boxes through the lines. In certain places, Wilmington, North Carolina, Weldon, North Carolina, Manassas Junction early in the war, you will find mountains of boxes from home because they just don't have the ability to get those boxes further down the line. It gets better in 1864. A lot of the different southern states will set up their own depots in Petersburg and Richmond. So foodstuffs coming up will try and make it to one of those depots, and then brigade officers will typically send a wagon to the depot to pick it up and get it to the men in the field. Oh, two of my favorite letters are in this chapter of the book. One of them deals with a soldier who's got these boxes. He's trying to get them up. The conductor of the train says, "You can't take those boxes." And there's a couple of other guys from his company with him, And they say, we'll take your boxes on the next train. Well, they all get to camp without his boxes. And he begs his officer, can you let me go back and try and find my boxes? And the officer says, no, we can't do that. And this man writes a letter back home to his wife. You should read the letter. I can't repeat the letter in here. You don't think your ancestors talk that way. But he let these guys have it in this letter. Just absolutely let him have it. My other favorite letter, probably my favorite letter in the entire book, deals with a soldier. His box from home has arrived. It's a communal box. So sometimes the people, since a lot of our Confederate ancestors came from the same areas, the same communities, they would have these communal boxes. The box arrives in camp. It's at night. They pry the lid of it off. He's given his bag out of this box. He runs over to the fire to see what's inside of it. And when he gets to the fire, he discovers that the bag is made out of his wife's dress. People of that time period, she probably only owned 2 or 3 dresses total. And he, in his letter home, writes that he has to walk away so the men don't see him crying, because he can see all the great times that they had when she was wearing that dress. It's an incredible, absolutely incredible letter. In camp, soldiers got rations, worked, most of the time it worked pretty well. Then we start on campaign. We're on our way to Sharpsburg, or we're on our way to Gettysburg. So you remember at the very beginning of our conversation, I described the mess and the mess equipment. You've got your fryer, your spider, your skillet, you've got your stock pot or whatever like that. Those go into quartermaster's wagons. And you would think that the quartermaster wagons and the commissary wagons would be together. No, this is the army you're talking about. The commissary wagons would come up, they would issue you your salt pork, and they would issue you flour, but you didn't have anything to cook it on or with. And the soldiers got really adept. They write about rolling their flour out on a gum blanket, wrapping it around a ramrod to cook. Meat was baked on a board or rock or eaten raw. Yorktown, Virginia, April 1862, a Louisiana soldier complained that they could not cook in the trenches and could not find a place in the rear to establish a kitchen. So it was, quote, raw meat and hard biscuits. The meat, the soldier writes, was pickled pork, and I thought it much better raw than cooked. During the 7 Days campaign, a Georgia soldier wrote, quote, as for hardships, half rations of meat and crackers or baker's bread, and no pan to fry our meat in. We just cut it off and throw it in the fire and broil it. I can eat fat meat covered in fire and coals and ashes, fire coals and ashes. W.W. Lenore, Captain, Company A, 37th North Carolina, will write home that he learned to eat raw bacon and like it. And we wonder why disease killed far more of them than bullets on a battlefield. That right there is one of those reasons. Numerous times throughout the war, the Confederates were able to capture federal supply depots like Harper's Ferry and Whitehall Plantation. One soldier, probably the most famous account, is the capture of Manassas Junction by Stonewall Jackson's men in August of 1862. A couple of different soldier accounts. A member of the 13th Virginia wrote, quote, of finding sutler stores of choice liquors and fruits and delicacies, great quantities of sugar and coffee, carloads of meat and flour, and a profusion of everything included in the rations of well-fed soldiers. A member of the 33rd Virginia found, quote, French mustard, sardines, canned meats, fruits, and desiccated vegetables. Y'all know what desiccated vegetables are? Federal government had this idea that they would take vegetables, would dry them out, would compress them into these chunks, these blocks, with the idea that when they are issued to the men, the soldiers will put them in, the federal soldiers will put them in them stock pots and boil them. Most accounts say that they boiled every bit of the nutritional value out of those vegetables, trying to make them edible. I want to know what my Confederate ancestors thought of that chunk of dried out vegetables. You know, are they standing there going, what do we do with this? You know, do we eat it like a plug of tobacco, or do we crunch it up with our rifle butts, or what? I don't have any accounts about what they thought of desiccated vegetables, but they captured them at several points during the war. Probably the other most famous account is Hampton's beefsteak raid in 1864. Wade Hampton took a group of Confederate cavalry, captured 2,500 head of cattle, and brought them back to the Confederate lines. That sounds like a lot of cattle, right? A lot of beef. It fed them in for about 5 weeks. That's how long 2,500 head of cattle lasted in 1864. If campaign was not enough, the soldiers go into the fight, into combat. Wagon trains bearing rations, wagon trains bearing your cooking utensils are now miles to the rear. Early in the war, there were some soldiers who brought slaves or hired slaves or freedmen to cook. And by 1864, the Confederate government has, the War Department has said that each company can hire up to 4 cooks to cook for the men. But these men are miles to the rear. So think about it. It's at Gettysburg. Your cook is back there. He has cooked up a bunch of rations. He has to move from where the commissaries and the quartermaster wagons are through the artillery reserve, through the division hospitals, through the ammunition reserve, and he has to find your company. So there is a whole host of men, cooks, wandering around in the day and the night going, hey, have you seen Company B of the 11th Alabama? Have you seen Company B of the 11th Alabama? Have you seen the 11th Alabama? And it goes on and on and on. And many times they never found their company because of the confusion that battle entails. One account that I did find of a soldier or of a cook finding his company, it's a Texas company, it's the Battle of Gettysburg, and he walks up with this bag of provisions, drops it behind a rock, and leaves because they are under fire. The lieutenant of the company points to one of the corporals and basically says, the man who used to issue the rations was killed yesterday. Corporal, I appoint you that job. So the corporal crawls up behind that rock, gets the foodstuffs out of the bag, tries to divide it up into equal piles, and then calls the men over one at a time to come get their foodstuffs under fire from behind this rock. That is eating in combat. Occasionally, soldiers will scrounge the battlefield. They will find cabins, they will find houses, they will go through the haversacks of dead Federals looking for foodstuffs. A member of the 55th Virginia Infantry, writing about the Battle of Second Manassas, says this, quote, I offered one of our men $5 for one slice of bacon. He refused to let me have it. So I went across the battlefield in search of something. I found a dead Yankee. I took his haversack to the firelight and found some bloody crackers, which I scraped his lifeblood from and ate. We would have a hard time imagining how hungry they were. U.S. Army tells us today that a soldier in combat needs about 5,500 calories a day. They got about 500 if they were lucky. And yet they still accomplished absolutely amazing stuff. Absolutely amazing stuff. Probably the best fed the soldiers ever were on the way to Gettysburg. They liberated the countryside at will. And yes, I know that General Lee issued 2 special orders saying that Confederate soldiers did not need to take food from the civilian population. The commissaries were supposed to come along and they were supposed to buy food with Confederate IOUs that basically said, once the war is over, you submit this to the Confederate government and you will get paid for it. And they did. Confederate commissaries did that. The wagon train coming back out of Virginia, going to Winchester, Virginia, coming out of Pennsylvania, going to Winchester, was 20, 30 miles long. And it's those foodstuffs that feed Lee's army through the rest of 1863. However, despite what General Lee said in his special orders, once the men got across the Potomac River, they liberated the countryside rapidly. William Dorsey Pender, Confederate Major General, were right that they were well behaved until they got across the Potomac, and then there was no stopping them. They had seen what the Federal soldiers had done in Virginia. They had letters home about what the Yankees were doing here in Alabama and Georgia and North Carolina. And they took every chicken and hog and everything out of the corn cribs, everything that they could get. I don't fault them for that. They were hungry. Probably the worst time the Confederates were fed was after the breakthrough on April 2nd of 1865. The commissary in 1864, 1865 wanted to issue the army rations for 7 days at one time. It would preserve horse flesh. It would help the railroads. I mean, it would really help. By this point in time, though, the men are so hungry, they start to steal from each other. Mahone's old brigade will raid the commissary wagons of the Florida Brigade, Lane's brigade, or the Florida Brigade under David Lang, and then other folks after that. They are so hungry because even if even if they get rations for 7 days, what they get will feed them for 2 or 3 days, and they just go hungry for the other 3 or 4 days. So they are desperately hungry by the time the breakthrough takes place. And for the men around the Petersburg front, they don't have time to get anything. The Federals, boom, hit the lines, and they are forced back. Those in the Richmond front have a little more time to get things, but it's really not much better. Barry Benson of the 1st South Carolina recalls stealing some hogs from a Virginia farmer, killing the hogs, and then going to the farmer and saying, "Hey, we got these hogs." He didn't say they were his hogs. "Can we borrow a pot?" And the farmer will loan them a pot to cook the hogs in. Benson also writes that they were so tired that they fell asleep, and the next morning they had hog jelly instead of actually hog meat. Henry Kent Douglas, one of the other staff officers, will write of taking, quote, "corn from my horse, beating it between stones, and I tried to swallow it. This little army was willing to march and fight, but starvation made stragglers of them." The federal government in the winter of 64-65, we've got all this trench warfare going on east of Richmond, east of Petersburg, and south of Petersburg. The federal government will put flyers in newspapers traded between the lines saying that if you come through the lines with your accoutrements, we will buy the accoutrements from you and we will feed you. Grant ordered bakers to set up ovens right close to the Confederate lines so the Confederate soldiers could smell bread being baked. That smell would waft over psychological warfare. That smell would waft over the Confederate lines, and they were dreadfully hungry. And they left every night by the hundreds. Some of them went home, some of them went across the federal lines. There was a North Carolina soldier by the name of David Parker. He was older when he enlisted in 1862. He was 34. And he knew how to cook. I know 34 is not old, but it was then. He knew how to cook. And so he got a job cooking for his company officers. He didn't have to do drill. He didn't have to do guard duty. He had to procure the rations. He had to build the fire, gather the firewood, build the fire, cook the food, clean up afterwards. That was his job. And it was a pretty choice job. He really liked that job. What Parker does is he writes a series of letters home. Doesn't talk about big battles or grand schemes or how he felt about A.P. Hill or General Longstreet or any of those people. He talks a whole lot about food in his letters home. November 1862, he writes of, quote, only getting dry crackers and beef meat. I don't think I can stand the scarcities much longer. February 1863, quote, the company is living on very short rations at this time. A little over half rations is what they are getting at this place. They complain of not getting enough to eat. December 1864. It is the hardest time yet in this army that I have saw since I have been out in the service. And if it does not get better, the soldiers will not stand it long. They are all threatening to run away if they don't give them more to eat. Robert E. Lee, about the same time period, is almost writing, he pretty much is writing the exact same thing. January 1864, Robert E. Lee writes James Seddon, Secretary of War, quote, short rations are having a bad effect upon the men, both morally and physically. Desertions to the enemy are becoming more frequent. The men cannot continue healthy and vigorous if confined to the sparse diet for any length of time. Unless there is a change, I fear the army cannot be kept together. January 1865, quote, I have the honor to call your attention to the alarming frequency of desertions from this army. I have endeavored to ascertain the causes and think that the insufficiency of food and non-payment of troops have more to do with the dissatisfaction among the troops than anything else. I have no doubt that there is suffering for the want of food. The ration is too small for men who have to undergo so much exposure and labor as ours. What happens in January of 1865? Fort Fisher falls, and the port of Wilmington and the Cape Fear River is closed to blockade runners. Lee has almost no other place to draw foodstuffs from. Hunter and Sheridan have raided the Shenandoah Valley and pretty much burned it out. Everything north of the Rappahannock River, north of Fredericksburg, is under federal control. You've got Federals that have started to raid Southwest Virginia, Saltville, in that area. After the port of Wilmington is closed, Confederate armies surrender about 3 months later, 2.5 months later. I would argue, I do argue in the book, that the story of the Army of Northern Virginia, it may be any Confederate army, but especially the Army of Northern Virginia, is a story of food. When they are well fed, when the shad are running in April of 1863, the Confederate Army is there next to Fredericksburg. They go out there and they set up fisheries and they catch thousands of fish every day. And they're pretty well fed at that point in time. But once the food stops coming in, the men can only take so much and they start to go home. And Robert E. Lee is forced out of the trenches on April 2nd of 1865 and surrenders about a week later at Appomattox Courthouse. Y'all have probably heard a story, and I'll finish with this, about how generous General Grant was after Lee had surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse. You remember the story? Lee goes to Grant and says, my men are really hungry. And Grant goes, well, we'll send them some rations. Those rations were from a captured Confederate supply wagon. Grant was not being generous. He was just giving them something that he saw as a burden. So that's a little bit of the story of the Army of Northern Virginia and food. I encourage you to check out the books back there. Do y'all have any questions? Yes?
A lot of soldiers in the Army of Tennessee felt like the Army of Northern Virginia were getting way more than they were and better quality food than they were, and it was being held in storage when they were starving. Have you thought about doing a book on the Army of Tennessee, and
So
would it
far-
look that different from from Northern Virginia?
So far, the Army of Tennessee is much better fed. Think about the way that Lee is wedged in. He's got this little geographical area, especially after starting of 1863. You know, it's just above Richmond and Petersburg and back to the west. Well, the Army of Tennessee at that point in time, pick January of 1864, they've got most of Alabama, they've got all of Georgia, south of Atlanta, they've got South Carolina, they've got all the cattle coming up from Florida and the cracker drives. So typically, the Army of Tennessee was better fed. They may not have thought so, but they had more opportunities to get foodstuffs than the Army of Northern Virginia did. Now, a lot of the Army of Tennessee thought that they were getting shafted on most things, and they were to a large degree. The better stuff would go to the Army of Northern Virginia. Should I say that? I'll say that. Better officers went to the Army of Northern Virginia. If Robert E. Lee did not like you, you got shipped to the Army of Tennessee. We could go through a long list of generals after, First Manassas, 7 days, that are no longer with the Army of Northern Virginia. They're elsewhere. Even poor D.H. Hill, maybe the Confederacy's best fighting general, ran afoul of those folks in Richmond and wound up over here in the Army of Tennessee. Yes, sir.
I guess it's sort of hypothetical. I came in a little late. Didn't hear what you were saying about early in the war.
Right.
Do know that, Lee
Right.
and wasn't at the beginning, Stonewall Jackson, total war. That's what he wanted. He wanted to go straight in. He wanted to invade. He knew how nasty
He
knew
did.
how nasty it was going to be. Fought in the Spanish-American War. He knew it was going to be bloody and it was going to be nasty. He wanted to invade. Had the South invaded the North, because I heard you speaking about when they got to the North,
Yes.
all the food supplies. Had the Stonewall Brigade, had the Army of North Virginia invaded the North earlier in the war, as opposed to late 1864 or Gettysburg, how do you think rations would have changed?
So, and that's an awesome question. Yes, Jackson, when he's at Harper's Ferry in 1861, he is presenting plans. Robert E. Lee is not really involved in the Army of Virginia at this point. That's a little bit of a complicated story. But Jackson is presenting plans to his commanding officer, which is Joseph E. Johnston, saying, let's take this war across the Potomac River. Let's invade. And Jefferson Davis would turn him down every single time. And a lot of folks will criticize, we folks in the 21st century will criticize Johnston and Beauregard for not going on to D.C. after the Battle of First Manassas, or Bull Run. It's Manassas for us. But Joe Johnston actually, and both Beauregard actually write letters saying, we don't have any food. We have not stockpiled in July of 1861. We have not stockpiled enough stuff to allow us to go on campaign across the Potomac River and take D.C. The big question is, does taking D.C. do anything? And that's a huge question. It would have looked really bad for the North, but as far as cutting supplies and equipment, it would have done nothing. Because a lot of the federal supplies are coming from Philadelphia and Cincinnati and Boston and these other places. Washington, D.C. would have just looked really good on our resume. Hey, we captured Washington, D.C. And we could have sued for peace. And the northern population may have said, yes, let's have peace. Of course, politicians don't usually care what the population says. So who knows if there would have been peace or not. But it all comes to foodstuffs right after the Battle of First Manassas. Joe Johnston and Beauregard simply do not have enough food to allow the Army to go and lay siege to Washington, D.C. They probably don't have enough men either, but that's a problem. The food is always a problem. You cannot outmarch your supply lines. Sherman did that and just totally decimated the state of Georgia and South Carolina. We are not at that stage of the war in 1861, the South. I'm not even sure the South would have done that, period. Because while on the Gettysburg campaign, the Southern soldier would take, meat out of the smokehouse and chickens and whatever, they didn't burn a whole lot of houses like the Federals did.
Sherman didn't have to bother with fighting
No.
actual armies, he only had to bother fighting
No.
little tiny groups.
Because
here.
Hood had taken the army to Spring Hill, and actually Hood had come over here in this direction and then takes the army to Spring Hill and Nashville and destroys it. Destroys the army of Tennessee. My thought. Yes.
The salt, so valuable.
So valuable.
Yeah. How did-
We cannot imagine. I mean, we have salt sitting on the table, and if you need salt, you go to the store and buy a little container of salt. They needed 50, 100 pounds of salt a year to salt their meat down. There are salt facilities set up along the coast, Florida, North Carolina. They'll boil down seawater for the salt, and there are some natural salt areas, licks. Do y'all have natural salt here in North Alabama? I don't actually know the answer to that. There's a place in Virginia called Saltville, Virginia, and the water that bubbles out of the ground is laden with salt. And so both the military and the civilian population will go to Saltville to boil that water in these great big old vats, and we'll sack it up and bring it to back to wherever it needs to go. The Federals attacked Saltville twice during the war and tried to put an end to that salt works. And salt is also imported through the blockade as well. But salt is just as crucial as gunpowder for prosecuting the war. And it's a struggle. There are stories of women, civilians back at home, that will dig up the floors of their smokehouses to get the salt that has accumulated over the years. So they have salt for the meat. Because if you can't salt your meat, you don't have any meat to eat. And you could say, well, what about beef? Well, beef does not cure like pork does. So,
I think some in South Alabama and Pensacola and
right.
stuff.
Salt works.
We
Or
have
shut
mineral
down.
springs here, but they're not salty,
There
they
you
have
go.
other minerals.
I think that's what pissed off some of the units that started forming in 1862 after salt was gone. Pissed them off at home because they couldn't get salt.
Yeah.
So now I go fight. That's my reason for fighting.
You're gonna go fight for salt?
Yeah.
Like I said, it's hard for us to think about how important of a commodity salt was. There's actually a whole book about salt and the war. If you want the name of it, let me know later, and I can look it up on my library catalog. Once I get internet service, because I don't have any in this building. Maybe it's just me.
No, there's no cell phone service, you have to get that on the Wi-Fi here.
Okay,
And I can get you that if you want.
I'm okay.
Any other questions?
Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Since there was some forts along the coastline, did some Confederate soldiers get so desperate that they went over by the shore and boiled down all the salt water into salt for themselves?
It's a little more complicated than that.
Yeah.
They might have. I've not read of an individual doing that, just the government. There were both state and Confederate salt works. You're gonna need to boil a lot of water to get a little salt, which means you're gonna need a lot of firewood to boil a lot of water, and you're gonna need usually what they used is a really big cast iron pot. I've even seen a couple of occasions where they would take a locomotive boiler or a steam boiler and cut it in half and put the water in there and build the fire underneath it and try and boil it that way to get the salt.
They would
So
do that,
it's
yeah.
a major operation. But I never came across an individual soldier boiling to get salt. Yes, sir, in the back.
How much are your books?
The new book, Feeding Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, is $25. Most of the rest of them are $20. If you want to chat when we get done, I would love to chat with you. You can check me out online. I have like the only Confederate blog out there. It's called Looking for the Confederate War. I do a lot more with that in the wintertime than I do the summertime because I'm like out here getting ideas for things to write about, but not actually writing. And sometimes you can catch me live on Facebook and YouTube on Sunday nights. My channel is called Hardy on History. but I don't do that as much in the summertime as I do the winter, because I'm out here. So, thank y'all very much.
All right.